DC Comics' Elseworlds stories are some of my favorite that DC has ever put out. Exploring stories where the wild and unexpected can, and does, happen. Nothing is off limits. Today on Top 10 Nerd though, we're talking about 10 DC Elseworlds that we can't believe actually exist. Kicking off the list at number 10 is Justice Riders. You know what sells? Cowboys. Taking your characters and plopping them in a western setting is always a guaranteed money-making tactic. Sure, it's been done a million times, but in 1997, DC released Justice Riders, or in other words, a western Justice League composed of hootin' and hollerin' versions of Wonder Woman, Hawkman, Kid Flash, Martian Manhunter, Booster Gold, and Blue Beetle. It's honestly just wild. Obviously, to make the setting work, all the abilities of these heroes are turned way down, but in place of that, we got a quick drawing Martian Manhunter in a poncho and a big old hat, and Blue Beetle as a wacky scientist. I mean, come on. With all the style you might expect, the story is just as wild as the Wild West it takes place in. It follows Sheriff Diana Prince as she puts together this team of heroes to take on Maxwell Lord, who left her town a smoking stack of ruins. It's just a fun time and absolutely deserves your eyes on its paper, or screen, or whatever. Number 9, Justice League The Nail. This one is rather odd. It's kind of a Superman story, but without Superman. The premise is that the day that Kal-El crashed on Earth, the Kents drove over a nail and it gave them a flat tire, resulting in Superman never becoming a thing. And it's all based off a little poem that goes like this. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the message was lost. For want of a message, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a nail. Which is kind of cool. So essentially, it's all about the butterfly effect, which is kind of what Elseworlds is all about in the first place when you really think about it. Look at that. So, in this story, all the other heroes are here, but without that one central figure to embody their core values, without that main leader, the world actually fears the Justice League. The world is constantly standing against them, and the story shows how they struggle with not only the villains of the DC universe, but even their own public perception. And it's all because Superman is out of the picture. As much as it feels like a big testament to Superman's importance, it does actually show the strength of the other members of the League to a degree, which is nice because Superman is kind of boring. Sorry. Number 8, Kingdom Come. While a lot of the great Elseworlds stories deal with versions of specific characters, others deal with the whole DC universe of heroes and villains, and Kingdom Come is probably one of the best of that latter category. Here, the classic heroes who made up the Justice League, they've all basically retired. New heroes have sprung up in their place, but don't really hold the candle to those who came before, and they're also kind of evil. They barely care about saving people and cause a massive accident that takes out almost all of the Midwest of America. Superman in this world is convinced that the world did not want him to step down. Batman keeps Gotham in control using massive, powerful robots. Green Lantern sits in an emerald fortress above the earth just watching. The Flash has basically become the Speed Force and keeps his city safe by basically being everywhere all at the same time, existing in the time between seconds. Is really cool. It's almost as if the Justice League had retired and then all the corrupt heroes from the boys took their place, and then the retired heroes come back to correct everything. There's a lot more to it than that, with some really cool stuff going on in all different places. Kingdom Come is like a love letter to DC Comics by DC Comics, and it has some of the most beautiful comic book art you or I has ever seen. Number 7, Batman Dracula. Some of the coolest stories involve Batman, and I mean, let's be honest, Batman himself is one of the coolest heroes. He's also the most human, literally just being a regular human who fights among gods and aliens against some of the biggest threats to humanity, including vampires. And when he goes up against the baddest and biggest one, Dracula himself, Batman becomes more than a man. He becomes the most justice-driven, terrifying vampire you've ever seen, and it's dope. When Dracula comes to Gotham, a good vampire grants Batman the vampiric gift in order to take on Dracula himself. And the idea was so awesome that it became a whole trilogy. Starting with Red Rain, then Bloodstorm, and ending in Crimson Mist. All of which put the most obvious hero to become a vampire in one of the best Victorian horror styles, and with the most terrifying looks I have ever seen for the Dark Knight. Batman Dracula is truly one of the best versions of Batman ever, and 'tis all thanks to Elseworlds. Thank you. Number 6, Superman's Secret Identity. Now, to say that we can't believe this world exists is actually kind of a weird little stretch, because this is actually set in a world pretty much the same as ours. Coming from writer Kurt Busiek, who created his cult classic Astro City, which itself was a play on the DC Universe, DC Comics gave him the chance to write an actual actual story about his favorite superhero, Superman. Enter Superman's secret identity, which questions what would happen if Clark Kent existed in our own world. Just like our Earth, all the familiar DC Comics superheroes are just comic book characters, but for one boy in Kansas, who just happens to have the same name as Clark Kent, he discovers that he has Superman's superpowers for some unknown reason. This Elseworlds series covers a different era of Superman's life in each issue, from his teenage years to his old age, and then the birth of his superpowered daughters. It's just incredibly interesting to watch how this world works. Number 5. A League of One. Sometimes Elseworlds stories just bring us what we really want to see by asking the question of, why the heck not? And the Wonder Woman focused story Justice League A League of One by Christopher Mueller is one of those stories. The whole thing is just pure fun, basically armoring up Diana Themyscira in untold amounts of plot armor and letting her defeat each of her teammates in honestly some pretty genius moves, all in order to bring down an ultimate evil, a dragon queen by the name of Dracula Carfang. If that sounds like it came straight out of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, it really kind of feels that way. The book even picks up at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, setting up this ultimate evil. Speaking of Dungeons & Dragons though, the art in this book is all painted by Mueller himself, making it literally worthy of a Dungeons & Dragons cover, and it's filled to the brim with utter awesome fantasy mixed with superheroes, and honestly, 'tis just a really fun time for any Wonder Woman fan looking for something just a little bit different. Number 4. JSA The Liberty Files. The Justice Society of America, The Liberty Files, is a DC Elseworlds story from 2000 to 2003, which makes it non-canonical, obviously. Any story that lets writers go outside the rules of the DC canon always makes for stories that I personally love. But what's it about? The series took characters from the JSA but turned them into covert government operatives in World War II, and that is just the coolest thing. Specifically, the story centered on 3 heroes: Batman, who in this story is called Bat, Hourman, who's called Clock, and Dr. Midnight, called Owl. I know, really creative names, but the 3 were known as the Unholy Three, and their mission, at least in part 1 of the story, is to find Jack the Grin, who is the Joker, who has information about the German weapon Übermensch, or Superman. Are you sold yet? Because you should be, because it's really cool. Number 3, Batman I Joker. This comic may actually be one of my new favorites, and I'm almost ashamed to say I hadn't read it before. The Batman story is set in a cyberpunk dystopian future Gotham City where Bruce Wayne no longer lives. In his place is another Batman who goes by the title of the Bruce. The people of Gotham religiously worship the Bruce as their religious leader, with lackeys under him like the Gordon, who is like his herald, and his doctor. This descendant of Batman has created a city-wide cult of the Bruce, and every year, as a ritual, rebels to the rule of the Bruce are captured, brainwashed, and transformed to become, essentially, copies of Two-Face, Ra's al Ghul, Penguin, and the Riddler, with one more criminal turned into the Joker. These fake criminals are then set free into the streets of Gotham, locked into vehicles, and are chased by the mob, the Bruce himself, or brave citizens who attempt to destroy the villains in order to face the Bruce and become the next Bruce. It's like taking the movies Death Race and Running Man, mashing them together, and then injecting some absolutely wacky and wild art to create a world of pure chaos. I don't want to give away the details, so if you haven't, check this book out. Number 2, Gotham by Gaslight. Gotham by Gaslight, like most Elseworlds stories, is just super freaking cool. It's such an obviously brilliant concept. You take Batman, the greatest detective, and plop him in the Victorian era and have him take on one of the most compelling unsolved killer cases in history, Jack the Ripper. But then they go and make it even cooler by having Jack move to this really awesome Victorian Gotham City and give Batman and the Ripper a personal connection. The story even sees Bruce accused of being the killer himself, which adds yet another layer on top of everything else. Also, we have to talk about the incredibly cool art style in the comic, which came from Mike Mignola, who created Hellboy, and it just works perfectly in this Victorian setting. It's actually just a big old treat to read. Gotham by Gaslight was one of DC's most successful Elseworlds stories, and it even got a 2018 animated adaptation, but has a completely different ending. Both versions, though, are really entertaining. And finally, in at number 1, Superman Red Sun. Probably one of the most beloved Superman stories ever, this story asks the question of what would happen if Kal-El had landed not in Kansas, but in the Soviet Union. Superman grows under the ideals of communism and is used by the Soviets as their weapon, helping bring almost the whole world into a super Soviet Union. It sees other heroic characters like Wonder Woman and Batman in this completely different world, and it really plays with the idea of freedom over security. It paints this Superman in a much darker light, as he will go to incredibly surprising lengths to achieve his goal of Soviet domination. He goes up against a Lex Luthor who becomes president of the United States, has Brainiac as a supercomputer assistant who eventually turns on him, and the end of the whole story? It's truly a mind-boggling experience to say the least. Also, just like Gotham by Gaslight, in 2020 we got an animated version of this story as well, and it's incredible. Oh, and fun fact, Superman Red Son is real-life Superman Henry Cavill's favorite Superman story, which is just really interesting. But that's all she wrote. I'm Adam Andrews. Thank you so much for watching today on Top 10 Nerd. I will catch you all on the flippy flop, but until then, peace out, nerds.